This is David Bernstein. I'm President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. We welcome to you to this very special conversation that we're having on Iran. I know we're all very curious and concerned about the direction, and we want to hear from the best experts. And we're very, very fortunate today to have with us one of the top, Michael Singh, who is a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, one of the institutes that works very closely with us in informing our understanding of what's going on in the Middle East. And Michael really is a top expert on Iran. When you think Iran, he's one of the people you want to hear from right away. And we're very, very fortunate to have him. He, in addition to being a fellow, he's also served as in the National Security Council. From 2005 to 2008, he was responsible for devising and coordinating U.S. national security policy toward the region stretching from Morocco to Iran, with a particular emphasis on Iran's nuclear and regional activities. So, Michael, we're really honored to have you on, and would really look forward to hearing from you. We will be taking questions from you all, so please type them in where it says questions, and we'll be monitoring that. And about 15, 20 minutes into the conversation, I'll start to pick out some questions so that we can have a conversation with Mike. So, Mike, thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, David. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you. I should start by apologizing in advance. I am at home right now. I have a bit of a cold. I think it's JCPA fever. And so that's why you're sort of looking up at my chin, and I apologize in advance if my children wander through the frame here as well. Let me just start by first explaining what exactly was decided by President Trump. So starting perhaps with just a baseline of information. What the president announced yesterday was very straightforward and really very simple in a sense. He announced that he was withdrawing from the JCPOA, that the U.S. would no longer be a party to the Iran nuclear agreement, and that he was reinstating all U.S. sanctions against Iran that were waived or suspended pursuant to that agreement in 2015. It is a more far-reaching step than I think most of us expected him to take. I think that most analysts felt that if he decided not to waive the sanctions, that he would only announce that he wasn't waiving the sanctions that were actually due on May 12th. And those were just what we call the NDAA sanctions, which are the sanctions against Iran's oil exports. You may remember back in the sort of 2012, 2013 timeframe, this requirement that countries importing oil from Iran reduce those imports in 180-day increments. Well, these are those sanctions. These are the ones which were up May 12th. And they're back in force now. But he also rescinded the waivers of all the other sanctions against Iran. And those actually weren't even due until July 12th. And so he's done this early. So it is basically the sort of hardest exit, as it were, that the U.S. could have taken. These sanctions won't go into effect right away. I mean, technically, they are once again active in a sense. But most of the sanctions will have a 90-day wind-down period. That means, so if you're a business in the Netherlands, which is engaged in an insurance or a shipping contract with Iran, you basically have 90 days to try to wind down that contract, to finish it out or to rescind it. For the oil sanctions, the wind-down period is actually 180 days. That's in part a reflection of the fact that oil contracts tend to be longer term. In part, it's just a measure to try to ensure that the oil market itself doesn't experience too many dislocations as a result of the U.S. action. So there are these wind-down periods, and there's other things the United States has to do in that time frame. So, for example, all of the people who are taken off the sanctions list pursuant to the JCPOA actually need to be added back. So new designations of those people need to be issued. That's going to take some time. Treasury has to prepare statements and packages, evidentiary packages for all of these designations. And so presumably they'll aim to get that done within the next 90 to 180 days during these wind down periods. So the bottom line of all of that is U.S. sanctions are back. We're back in sort of 2012, as it were, and we're going to be seeking to punish, presumably, anyone doing business of almost any kind with Iran. What's not back are the UN sanctions. Many of you will remember in the debate over the JCPOA in 2015, questions about the snapback of UN sanctions. That was not an option that the Trump administration exercised. They could have, using the mechanisms in the JCPOA, chosen to force UN sanctions back into effect. What senior Trump administration officials said about that yesterday was, we consider ourselves entirely out of the agreement, including the snapback mechanism, and so we're not utilizing that mechanism. We're not utilizing any part of Resolution 2231 or of the JCPOA. We're simply, essentially, now acting as though it does not exist. So UN sanctions are not back. There may have been a certain pragmatism behind that decision. Obviously, other countries are not on board with the U.S. decision to exit the JCPOA, and so there may have been some concern that if those UN sanctions snap back, they simply wouldn't be respected by other countries, and that might be a worse outcome than simply leaving the sanctions in place. So the UN sanctions remain suspended, and of course all other countries' sanctions, such as European Union and so forth, also remain suspended. And this sets up a real asymmetry, a real divergence in the global sanctions regime, and we'll have to see how that plays out over time. The other thing which has not been done is the JCPOA itself is not dead necessarily. The U.S. has withdrawn, but of course this is an agreement to which there are multiple parties, actually 8 parties. Those parties were the U.S. And remain the U.K., France, Germany, the European Union, Russia, China, and Iran. So there's still 7 parties to this agreement. And now those 7 parties presumably will have to discuss amongst themselves whether or not they can preserve the agreement minus the United States. What we have heard so far from both the Iranians and the Europeans is that they're going to seek to do that. The door also was left a bit open by President Trump for new negotiations. He didn't announce that he was going to embark on a process of negotiations. That really wasn't what he said. Instead, he issued a memo to his senior staff, which basically said they should let him know if they think consultations with allies or a new deal is possible. But he laid out a very extensive range of requirements for a new deal, which go well beyond the nuclear question, include everything like human rights in Iran to cyber attacks on the United States and so forth. So it seems as though, at least initially, what they have in mind is that they'd only come back to the table for a grand bargain with Iran, not for a new nuclear agreement. So what are the implications of U.S. action? Well, they are extensive. So obviously, the European allies with whom we've worked on this issue for the past decade plus are unhappy about the American decision. From the European perspective, the JCPOA was a U.S. initiative. It was largely negotiated bilaterally between the United States and Iran, with which they were relatively satisfied, but had some concerns. From their perspective, the US E3, the E3 being UK, France, and Germany, over the past year or 18 months, were also a U.S. initiative, and those have also been abandoned by the United States. So from the European perspective, it looks like the U.S. is abandoning sort of 2 of its own diplomatic initiatives and now pursuing essentially a third. The Europeans, I think, engaged from their perspective constructively in those US E3 talks, had hoped that they would be able to reach an accommodation that would keep the United States in the agreement. And so, as I said, are disappointed with this response. I think the first priority for the European states will be to do what they think they need to do to safeguard their own interests. And the first step in this case will be to try to preserve the JCPOA. As I said, they've already indicated that they're going to do that. I think this is in part because they feel as though preserving the JCPOA might prevent the further escalation of this crisis by preventing the Iranians from taking dramatic steps forward on their nuclear program. I'm sure that in the backs of their minds, they also hope that at some point the U.S. might come back to the JCPOA. either because the Trump administration changes its mind, as President Trump has sort of suggested he is doing on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, or because there's simply a change in leadership, a new election in the United States, something like that. So preserving that framework seems to be a priority for the Europeans. For the Iranians, it's a bit harder to analyze what they do. There are those in Iran who never liked this agreement in the first place, who don't like the idea of any kind of accommodation with the West, who don't like, for either principled or parochial reasons, the idea of reintegrating Iran's economy into the international economy. My sense is those voices are really not a majority, that the decision to enter into the JCPOA was a decision really of Iran's supreme leader, who does have supreme authority. And so now Iran, I think, will probably engage in a process of trying to get a better deal, as it were, from the JCPOA's remaining parties. So they now have leverage of the same sort, really, that the U.S. had until yesterday, and that's other states' desire to preserve the JCPOA. They'll, I think, try to leverage that desire for further gains. Not so much, I think, in the nuclear realm, but more in the economic and sanctions realm. So perhaps to compensate for where the U.S. is going, they'll ask the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese for even further benefits under the deal. Now, it's entirely possible the Iranians will also feel as though they have to take certain steps ahead in their nuclear program to sort of retaliate, as it were, for the U.S. decision. Again, I think that if the Iranians decide to take small or symbolic steps, it's possible the Europeans, Russians, Chinese just ignore those steps and say, well, that's sort of the predictable result, in a sense, of the tensions here. If they take dramatic steps, say resume enrichment at 20% or try to restart their plutonium producing reactor, then what you might see is you might actually see the JCPOA fall apart entirely. And frankly, other countries may have very little choice but to join the United States in reimposing sanctions. Surely the Iranians understand all this, and this will all factor into their own decision-making. The other, of course, implication now is that the U.S. Will presumably embark on some sort of sanctions campaign against those who are doing business with Iran. This is probably trickier than many people understand at first. The U.S. sanctions are, in fact, market-based, and so they're trying to, what they do is, instead of levying penalties against governments, instead of levying penalties against countries, what they do is they level penalties against private sector entities that choose to do business with Iran in certain sectors and of certain types, for the most part. And the chances are that multinational firms, fearing the prospect of a loss of access to U.S. markets, will in fact respect these sanctions, because the Iranian market's not nearly as attractive, obviously, for most firms as the U.S. market. However, the question really will be translating that pressure into policy outcomes. And that, of course, requires, first and foremost, you know what outcomes you're seeking. And then second, that you use diplomacy to try to translate pressure into results. So what we're going to need to see from the United States is this kind of diplomatic sanctions campaign. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. When I was serving on the NSC, we engaged in intensive sanctions diplomacy. I would meet frequently with my counterparts from London, Paris, Berlin. So would my counterparts at the State Department, to secure buy-in for sanctions and to plot the next steps ahead. And we were doing that, of course, amid an environment really of strategic convergence. Our European partners didn't always agree with our tactics, but they generally agreed on the objectives. They generally agreed on the nature of the problem. The Trump administration is going to be starting at a very different point. They're going to be starting at a point where there isn't that kind of agreement. And it'll really be the first time that we've tried to erect a sanctions regime amid that kind of divergence with allies. In the Russia and North Korea cases, two other secondary sanctions regimes in recent history, there's been a similar strategic convergence between the United States and our allies. So this will be a new experience. We'll also need to manage various policy trade-offs. if you look at the patterns of Iranian trade, especially trade in oil, a good deal of Iran's trade in oil is going to countries like China, India, even South Korea and Japan and Turkey and so forth. All of these are countries with whom we're engaged in other high-profile diplomatic initiatives. So you think about China. We just had a large U.S. economic delegation in Beijing talking about North Korea, talking about trade tariffs especially. And so at some point, inevitably, the U.S. government will need to decide how they're going to prioritize these issues. Countries like India, which imports quite a bit of oil from Iran, is really seen by the United States, by successive administrations now, as a potential ally, as a burgeoning ally, let's say, in our Indo-Pacific strategy. And that strategy is largely focused on addressing what we see as our largest strategic threat in the world, and that's the rise of China as a near-peer rival, as we say. We'll have to decide, is it worth taking major action against India in this context, or do we want to sort of keep our powder dry for these other issues? These are the types of things that are now going to have to be discussed in government. We still haven't seen, I would say, something which I'm very keen to see, and which I think probably a lot of you are keen to see, and that's some indication of a broader Iran policy. We've had a lot of debate over our Iran nuclear policy over the past 3 years, very little over our broader Iran policy, over countering what Iran is doing in Syria, over the extension of Iran's influence in places like Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen, Iran's support for terrorism, and so forth. We really have spent almost all of our time debating the JCPOA, whether to stay in, whether to get out. And yesterday in his announcement, President Trump kind of referred to these broader issues, but really gave no sense of what the U.S. might be willing to do or what plan it had to address them. And secondary sanctions, while powerful in their own way, will not avert an Israel-Iran war, for example. It will not stop the Iranians from entrenching themselves along the Golan Heights or from sort of dominating the Lebanese political system. There's only so much that sanctions really can accomplish. So here we are sort of amid an environment of expanding Iranian power, potential Iran-Israel war, potential Iran-Saudi Arabia war, and still really not much commentary of any sort from U.S. officials on those problems. A lot of fixation still on the nuclear issue, which is an important issue, but certainly not the only one that we face with Iran. So looking at the road ahead, and this will be just the end of my comments before I take your questions, before David takes your questions. First, I would say that, look, reimposing these sanctions is going to be difficult. It's going to require a lot of careful thought and planning. And probably what we really need is a phased approach to the next steps. So we need to think about what is our near-term goal. And a sort of practical near-term goal might be a sort of joint U.S.-EU or U.S.-E3 understanding about Iran policy, about the road ahead, even if it's just an agreement on principles. That is a much likelier prospect than even opening a new nuclear negotiation with the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, and those states in the near term, and would also potentially strengthen our hand going into any such process. In a sense, our proximate problem here, our near-term problem, is that we have this tremendous rift with allies, and patching that up should be a matter of priority. So rather than thinking about, well, let's turn up the pressure until we solve the whole problem, I think we need to think about tackling it in phases. Second, I think that we do need a diplomatic roadshow to explain what we have done, where we're going, and what are our specific goals with respect to individual countries like China, like India, like the EU, like Japan and South Korea, and make whatever specific requests we have of them. These secondary sanctions are a very broad tool, and we now need to have tailored strategies for each of these places, again, also taking into account the wider context in all those policy trade-offs I mentioned. And then finally, we still need a comprehensive strategy with respect to Iran. The prospect of Iran-Israel war, all these other regional problems, these are not problems that sanctions will solve. Sanctions might be part of the solution, but they simply aren't the entire solution. And some of the things we're doing, such as talking about withdrawing our 2,000 troops from Syria, actually undermine the idea of countering Iran. And so we really need to think about what are our goals, and then we need to take our whole policy toolkit and think about how we're going to apply those tools together in concert to achieve those goals. It makes no sense to sort of over here do something which benefits Iran, and then over here sanction Iran in an effort to sort of achieve the opposite result. We need to ensure that the left hand and the right hand are working together in the U.S. government, which is, I can tell you from personal experience, a lot harder than it sounds. So I look forward to taking your questions, whatever they may be.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael, for that very comprehensive talk. We have some questions. The first one comes from Eric Passman. What will the U.S. do to get the EU on board with sanctions? Will it work? I know you touched upon this. Can the U.S. get the EU on board?
Well, it's going to be very hard because not just because the EU is obviously upset over the U.S. withdrawing from the JCPOA. They'll in a sense get over that and act according to national interests, as countries tend to do. But because I think their priority will be to preserve the JCPOA, which will really mean not cooperating with the U.S. sanctions in any explicit way. I think that actually the reverse will happen. They'll try to block the U.S. sanctions. I think that will be hard. I don't think they really have the ability to prevent their own firms from cooperating in a sense, or at least complying with the U.S. sanctions. But I don't think you'll see any real kind of interest in getting on board with the U.S. sanctions, at least on the nuclear front. I don't rule out that we could still see joint sanctions, say, against Iran's missile program or for its regional activities. So I think that has become harder today. So again, this is where we have to think about our diplomatic strategy. Do we want to try to enforce these U.S. sanctions against Europe, or do we want to try to enforce them elsewhere, say against the Chinese or against other states? Or do we simply want to allow for a time the threat of sanctions to percolate, which will, even the possibility, will impact the decisions that firms are making? So a lot of this will depend on what are we actually trying to achieve. If we're trying, as I sort of suggested in the first phase, to achieve some kind of joint understanding with the Europeans about where are we going, what are our goals, and so forth, then simultaneously sanctioning European firms is probably not a great way to get that done.
Thank you. So this question comes from Marty Bressler, New York. Is there any justification under the agreement for the U.S. withdrawal from the agreement, or did the United States merely break its word?
If you listen to President Trump's comments yesterday, it doesn't seem like the U.S. was seeking to present a case that Iran had somehow not complied with the deal. And senior U.S. officials, from Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, to Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, to our intelligence officials, have all said recently they felt Iran had complied technically with the deal. And so I think that the case that was made yesterday was really twofold. Number one, that it was a bad deal to begin with. So rather than Iran's compliance being the problem, it's the deal itself that's the problem. And that's something, frankly, that I agree with. I was a critic of the JCPOA, not the JCPA. Let's be clear about that. In 2015, and not because I felt Iran wouldn't comply with it, but because I felt it would be easy for Iran to comply with it. They didn't demand enough of Iran. And then I think the other case that was made by President Trump was simply that the Iranian regime itself presented a whole range of other problems that demanded U.S. response, and that somehow the nuclear deal was an impediment to doing that. So I think that was the case that was made. So we are simply withdrawing from it rather than suggesting that others haven't complied.
Great. All right, this one comes from Jeff Chesky. Do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu's presentation last week tipped President Trump into his decision, or do you think that decision had made long ago? Was it just a campaign promise kept?
I don't think I know the answer to that. I think that, it's likely that this is something that President Trump intended to do regardless. It would be my guess. Because I don't think that too many people inside or outside government felt that the presentation that Prime Minister Netanyahu made really sort of fundamentally changed the intelligence picture. Now, I can't say that with 100% certainty because there were obviously tens of thousands, reportedly, of documents that were seized by the Israelis, and it may be that there was new information in those documents that did affect intelligence assessments of Iran's nuclear program. But I think that the idea that Iran was deceptive, the idea that Iran had a nuclear weapons program and so forth, these are all articles of faith amongst U.S. policymakers. And so really all it will have done was reinforced that sense and reinforced perhaps the idea that it was a mistake to have not required Iran to have made a more complete declaration of its past nuclear activities as part of this deal. Again, that was one of the criticisms that critics such as myself leveled about the deal in the first place. So it's not to say that the concern that Prime Minister Netanyahu expressed in that briefing wasn't a valid one. It was, but it wasn't a new one, I would say. So I doubt that it was the decisive factor. Now, it may well have sort of helped, let's say, to provide the kind of basis for explaining the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal. It may have affected the atmosphere in which the policy deliberations were being taken. All those things may be true, but President Trump obviously has talked about ripping up this deal. He's talked about the deal being inadequate for a long time, well before that presentation was. I'd be surprised if it were decisive.
Great. All right, another question. What previous nuclear agreements have been signed with elimination of rogue behavior as one of the provisions? If there have not been any, why is the current administration breaking an agreement to include this provision?
Well, we don't have too many examples of these kinds of nuclear agreements, period. You could point to agreements in the past, like the 1994 agreed framework with North Korea, which didn't really address non-nuclear issues and is closer, in a sense, to the spirit of the JCPOA, and that it was sort of this kind of quid pro quo. North Korea took certain nuclear steps in exchange for certain benefits from the West, and of course that agreement eventually fell apart. And it fell apart for a couple of reasons. Number one was the U.S. was reluctant to actually provide the benefits. Congress was reluctant to provide those benefits for what the North Koreans were giving. Number two, the North Koreans were engaged in clandestine nuclear activity separate from the agreement. And then number three, we had a lot of other concerns about North Korea, and it was tough ultimately to kind of separate these policy realms. And I would argue you've really seen something similar happen now with the JCPOA, that really the JCPOA probably always was going to face real difficulties because, again, it represented this effort to sort of carve out the nuclear issue amid a very contentious, very difficult, and often even confrontational, hostile relationship. That's tough to do. We did it to some extent with the Soviets, but the types of arms control treaties we signed with the Soviets were quite different because, of course, they had nuclear weapons. We had nuclear weapons, and the point of the treaties was to reciprocally limit our stockpiles and types of nuclear weapons in our mutual interests, essentially. So a different kind of animal. If you look at the nuclear agreement with Libya, which has been referenced many times now by Ambassador Bolton, the new national security advisor, it was the kind of agreement that actually went well beyond the nuclear realm. It required Libya not just to dismantle its nuclear infrastructure entirely, but also to make certain promises on terrorism and so on and so forth. And that was because those things were necessary to get the sanctions lifted. So first, Muammar Gaddafi really had engaged in a broader kind of shift, let's say. He wanted to kind of come in from the cold. And then second, there's no way that Congress was going to lift the sanctions on Libya without sort of actions that went well beyond the nuclear realm. And so we would, in a sense, it was a negotiation not just between the U.S. and Libya, with almost every member of Congress who had some concern that had to be somehow satisfied with the Libyans. And we went back and forth and back and forth. And there were times when I felt the whole thing was going to fall apart because of some sort of new requests we were making or so on and so forth. But it ultimately worked. And then, of course, a couple of years later, we overthrew Gaddafi, and that didn't send an encouraging signal for others to engage in the same kind of process, obviously.
Right. So, what do you make of President Trump's? This comes from Michael Sievers. What do you make of President Trump's appeal to the people of Iran? Is there any real possibility of a people's uprising on the scale of those that took place in 2009?
Well, there is real economic and perhaps political turmoil in Iran right now. We saw, for example, just at the beginning of this year, end of last year, these uprisings, which were actually quite widespread. None of them was quite as large as what happened in 2009. So you could say they were more geographically dispersed, but in any given place, much smaller than the 2009 protests. They also seem to be focused less on the kind of upper crust elites like the 2009 protests, and focused more at the bottom of the economic ladder, the working classes, who are considered often the base of support of the regime. Now, what's interesting about this is that not so much that these recent protests will kind of grow and be the death knell of the regime, more that if you look at the history of Iranian revolutions and political uprisings, there were three in the 20th century. We tend to focus on the 1979 one, but in fact, there was one in the 1950s and another in the earlier part of the 20th century. They tend to only happen when you have these disparate groups which find common cause against the regime, often for very different reasons. Often their grievances are actually quite different from one another. So you might have the religious class with one grievance, the working class with another, but they all agree that the regime is the problem, and so they come together and rise up. It's possible that because these protests earlier this year were focused on a very different segment of society than the 2009 protests, that's actually quite an alarming sign for the regime, that it's losing support of all these different factions and groups. You add that to the economic turmoil, which already exists and probably will deepen as a result of sanctions. And yes, there's a lot of negative indications for stability in Iran. But I'll tell you what we don't know. There's two big things we don't know. One is we really don't know when all that might come to a head. This is one of the hardest things analytically to do, is to predict the collapse of states. We have really almost never done it successfully. We didn't predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. We didn't predict what happened in the Arab Spring in 2011. We haven't predicted really any of the uprisings in Iran ever. And so the idea that somehow now kind of we're onto it, I take with a real grain of salt. Number two, we have no idea what would follow this regime or whether it would be any better for our interests. Typically what has happened in Iran is, again, you have these groups come together. Their common cause is they hate the regime. But then once the regime is gone, they've lost that common cause and they turn on each other, and you have a very difficult period. This is what resulted in 1979 in the rise of this particular regime. You had actually quite a few seculars and others who hated the Shah, but themselves weren't radical sort of Islamists, but they kind of hitched their wagon to the radical Islamists and were subsequently purged as a result. And so it didn't work out for them. And didn't work out well for us either. So it's entirely possible you see turmoil in Iran that actually goes poorly for American interests, which is why simply kind of hoping that it'll happen is really not a satisfactory American policy.
Great. All right, this comes from Henry Maurer. Will the U.S. withdrawal help or hinder the security of Israel?
Will the U.S. withdrawal help or hinder the security of Israel? It's a good question. Obviously we saw some apparent friction just last night between Iran and Israel, which I don't think was necessarily related to Trump's JCPOA announcement. I think it has more to do with the ongoing exchanges between Iran and Israel over Syria. I personally don't think that the Iranians will choose to retaliate for Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA by attacking Israel. They have good reasons to be deterred from attacking Israel, regardless of this other question. Some people have said, well, maybe the Iranians were on good behavior because they're hoping not to get sanctions reinstated. Well, it didn't look like good behavior to me, and I'm sure it didn't look like good behavior to the Israelis. And so I didn't sense a whole lot of restraint, nor do I sense that it's any easier for Iran to attack Israel today than it was yesterday. Israel's a formidable military power. I think the Israelis and probably the Trump administration hopes that, in fact, this withdrawal from the JCPOA will free them up to impose sanctions on Iran, not just in the nuclear realm, but to impose sanctions on Iran for its behavior in places like Syria and so forth. I think that's true. I think that this does create new sanctions options for us, whatever the downsides may be. But it's not sufficient ultimately. I think that if we really want to prevent an Iran-Israel war, if we really want to kind of knock Iran back in Syria, sanctions aren't going to cut it. It's just not going to work. And so we'll need to show that we're willing to act in other ways, whether that's sort of the low-level application or threat of military force in Syria, which we haven't been willing to do at this stage, or whatever other steps, trying to rally, say, other states to pressure Iran for what it's doing in Syria, which probably has been made a bit harder by this announcement yesterday. So I think that if we want to do something on that front, really, it'll have to be independent of the JCPOA withdrawal. We just haven't heard anything along those lines yet. In fact, we've heard steps to suggest we want to get out of Syria.
Great. All right. Given that the Iran nuclear agreement was deeply flawed, in this person's opinion, but imposed short-term restrictions on Iranian nuclear activity, did the U.S. withdrawal decrease or increase the prospects that Iran will ultimately develop nuclear weapons?
It's a tough question to answer. I mean, obviously, opinion is sharply split on this question. To me, the JCPOA was really a way for Iran to do two things. From Iran's perspective, it was a way for Iran to get sanctions lifted, obviously, but also a way for Iran to preserve and really kind of set in stone, as it were, its nuclear option. Because the deal didn't require Iran to dismantle its nuclear infrastructure. It left Iran with all the key pieces of a nuclear weapons program, and in a sense gave blessing to that program by saying, well, yes, affirmatively, you can have this stuff. So by the time the initial restrictions on Iran expired, Iran would have been in a relatively good place if it chose sometime in the future to pursue nuclear weapons. And in fact, the deal would have allowed Iran to, even while complying with the deal in the initial period, somewhat improve its nuclear weapons capabilities by improving its centrifuge technology and improving its missile technology. So I wasn't one who thought that the JCPOA was really all that it was cracked up to be in terms of stopping Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapon or really even delaying the uranium program. From my point of view, Iran needed time anyway to work on certain things, and the JCPOA largely conformed to the timelines that they needed. Now, none of that should be taken to mean that simply withdrawing from the JCPOA stops Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. I have always been in favor of a diplomatic agreement that somehow stops Iran's nuclear weapons program in a more comprehensive way. To me, the way to do that would have been through a U.S. E3 agreement to strengthen the JCPOA, using as leverage other states' desire to preserve the basic framework of the agreement. And that would have required us to improve basically along the lines that President Trump talked about, the access for inspectors, the sunset provisions, and addressing the delivery vehicle questions, the missile question. That wouldn't have been perfect. It still would have left Iran with the ability to do centrifuge R&D, for example. But it would have been a lot better than the initial JCPOA. So, no agreement doesn't really help you because, as we saw in the past, simply sanctions don't stop the Iranians from working on nuclear sort of enrichment and so forth. So the Trump administration will have to show some path to either getting a better agreement or some other way of stopping Iran's nuclear activities. And so far, again, we have not seen that articulated. That really now the onus is on the Trump administration to do that.
Great. What probability do you think Iran will launch missiles toward Israel via Lebanon or Syria? So this gets us off the nuclear question into the broader regional tensions that we see now. And this comes from Todd Raskow.
What probability? It's hard to say. I don't know, 27%. I think that the Iranians are in a tough spot, frankly, because I do think that Iran would like to retaliate against Israel for actions such as the action against the T4 base, interdictions of Hezbollah weaponry, and so forth. At the same time, I think that Iran is deterred from doing so because they understand that Israel has tremendous retaliatory power, and they I think were surprised in 2006, for example, at just how devastating the Israeli response was. I don't think that Iran in 2006 or Hezbollah in 2006 really intended to have the kind of conflict they had. And of course, Iran will take note of Israel's warnings that Tehran may be sort of open, open field for Israeli retaliation if there's an attack on Israel proper. So Iran has to balance these kind of desire to retaliate, the desire to deter Israel, with the fact that they themselves are deterred by Israel. And so I'm not sure, frankly, how that will play out. What I would normally say is I would expect Iran to try to find other ways to retaliate, terrorist attacks, things which are deniable, rather than sort of full frontal attacks against Israel itself. And I still tend to think that that's the case. I would be surprised to see a sort of a formal kind of full-bore attack by Iran on Israel, because I think Iran probably knows that it would ultimately not win that fight. The difference maybe would be that maybe Iran feels that if attacks from Syria, that Israel's response would be confined to Syria. Maybe it feels that if Hezbollah attacks, that Israel's response would be confined to Lebanon. But even there, Iran can really ill afford to lose Hezbollah or to lose Hezbollah's capabilities, given that Syria is still very much up for grabs. So it's hard to say. I personally don't think that there's much in it from an Iranian perspective to try to tangle with Israel right now with so many other balls up in the air.
Right. All right. So what might be the chances that this will be viewed as American? This comes from Cantor Neil Schwartz. Israel American Jews are running U.S. policy, that it'll actually fuel anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories in certain sectors.
Well, look, there's two ways of answering that question, right? One is that I think that the states which are going to be supportive of this, for better or for worse, are Israel, Saudi Arabia, and a couple of other conservative Persian Gulf states. And it'll get support from Republicans in the United States, but not from Democrats for the most part. So that will be the coalition, and the rest, and the rest of the world and the rest of the political spectrum is going to be disapproving of this action. That said, I think that look, nobody needs an invitation to engage in conspiracy theorizing and blaming of this or that group, and so that stuff is going to happen, regardless. I mean, it's you read books about how the JCPOA came about, and there's a couple out already. Who are the villains? The villains are always going to be the Republicans, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, because it's convenient. Look, the real villains here, from my point of view, are the Iranians. Iran is the one which is pursuing these nuclear weapons, pursued nuclear weapons clandestinely over time. Iran is the one doing what it is in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and so forth. It's the one sponsoring terrorism and so forth. And it's going to be important, I think, in the wake of this decision, to remind people of that while you may not like American diplomatic tactics, and plenty of people don't, let's remember that we're all unified in our desire to stop what Iran is doing, whether it's on the nuclear front or the regional front. That's not just an Israeli-Saudi point of agreement. That's something the Europeans agree on, that China agrees on, that even Russia, to some extent, agrees on. And so it'll be important for the Trump administration and for others to kind of try to place the emphasis there and try not to distract from that or allow the Iranians to distract from that.
Right. Okay. We have time for one more question. It comes from Richard Samet. Do you believe that the U.S. withdrawal from this agreement will impact the negotiations with other countries, particularly North Korea?
It's a tough question. I tend to think that the answer is no, that this won't have a big impact one way or the other on the North Korea talks. I think that those who are in favor of the decision have said, and I think John Bolton said this yesterday, well, this shows the North Koreans that we won't accept a suboptimal deal. I don't know if the North Koreans, frankly, take that lesson from it. North Korea is in a very different strategic situation than Iran. North Korea has nuclear weapons. It has nuclear-armed ICBMs even. And I think that North Korea is probably under the impression, rightly or wrongly, that the talks with the United States ultimately are about negotiating the terms of America's capitulation to North Korea's status as a nuclear power. And the Trump administration will have to disabuse Pyongyang of that notion. I don't think what President Trump did yesterday truly disabuses Pyongyang of that notion, because I think they feel as though they're in a different category than the Iranians. Others have suggested that, well, this will show American kind of faithlessness, that we can't be trusted to keep a deal. I don't think that's right either. I mean, in a sense, it may show that if you're going to negotiate one of these deals, actually you're better off negotiating it with the Republicans, because, here we have a Republican president breaking a deal negotiated by a Democratic president with a kind of what's seen in the United States as an adversary. It's hard to imagine the opposite situation. So it's hard to imagine, some Democratic president comes along next and says, hey, I'm going to get out of this deal with North Korea because Donald Trump negotiated it. That doesn't seem like a plausible scenario. So it may actually lead the North Koreans to say, hey, well, better to negotiate with this guy than to negotiate with somebody else. But my guess is the two will just be totally independent, that they're both based on unique circumstances in different regions of the world, different power dynamics, and they don't have much to do with each other, period. Where they might intersect, again, is where we have our own policy trade-offs to make, because some of the same actors are kind of supporting players in both arenas. So the Chinese, for example, the Indians, the Russians, the Europeans will need to decide, if you make a trip to Beijing, are you threatening them with sanctions over Iran, or are you asking them for help on North Korea, or are you trying to somehow pull off both? That's a tough question. It takes a lot of diplomatic savvy, and so we're going to need to brush up on that a bit.
Great. Mike, this has been fascinating, very important discussion for us. We're all struggling with how to handle this in our own communities, how to talk to our own stakeholders, how to talk to the press, and how to represent the Jewish community in these times. And we really appreciate your input into that thinking, and we very much value the partnership with the Washington Institute and your work as well. So thanks again, and thanks for being with us. And thank you all for coming, and we'll bring more to you soon. Be well.
Thanks, David, and thanks, everyone.